Okay, it's my pleasure to invite Dr. Gleicher to the platform. He is certainly well known to all of you as the Medical Director and Chief Scientist of the Center for Human Reproduction and the President of the Foundation for Reproductive Medicine, your host for this meeting. Dr. Gleicher's presentation is entitled Androgen Supplementation, a Model for Therapeutic Interventions into Early Stages of Follicle Maturation in Humans.
Thank you, David. Let me start by reemphasizing something I said in my introductory comments at the very beginning this morning. One of the reasons for this conference was our attempt to bring clinical and basic reproductive biology together. And I want to point out that you so far, and we are now only moving into the more clinical part, but you have already heard two areas where, had this kind of collaboration existed earlier, we probably would have figured out things much earlier. The first one was Magdalena's presentation this morning, where she told you about her mouse model and data her laboratory developed almost 10 years ago, where when they made chimera from certain cell lineages, the embryos started developing but died off. And if she made chimeras just out of cells that were the inner cell line lineage, she had great offspring pups. Now, many of you are clinicians, and I'm sure you're seeing blighted ova in your clinical practice all the time. And what are blighted ova? They are trophectoderm without inner cell mass. And think about it. Have we ever thought about this in our clinical practice? But had we known this, I think we would look at blighted ova suddenly very differently. And I'm mentioning this now in my introduction to this androgen talk, because what I'm going to talk to you about is about the 12-year history where after one of our patients, unbeknownst to us, at age 42, almost 43, started taking DHEA and suddenly started producing more and more eggs and embryos from cycle to cycle, we got interested in DHEA. And we made a lot of clinical observations that supported the use of DHEA. But we had no idea why. Until a Retro's paper came out 6-7 years ago that he just told you about, reporting on their mouse experience, on their mouse knockout experience. And suddenly everything that we had seen over the preceding 4 or 5 years in clinical practice, and we had recorded and we had reported, suddenly it all made sense. So here are two examples of how important this interplay is. And since this paper came out, we established contact, and now we're in the beautiful situation that if he sees something in his mouse models, we can try it in the clinical experience, and vice versa. If we want to understand something, we ask him to model it out in the mouse. And that is obviously the perfect situation. So with this short introduction, conflict statement, I do have some potential conflicts here. I'm a co-inventor on quite a number of patents that claim benefits from androgen supplementation in various forms, including DHEA. I'm also a shareholder in a company that produces a DHEA product. I think that's pretty much it. So please consider that in my presentation. I will be talking to you today, first of all, a little bit as an introduction about the physiology of follicle maturation. I will be talking about a new paradigm of early intervention into follicle maturation, I want you to think about the fact that in 60 years of relatively modern infertility care, since gonadotropins entered clinical practice, all we have been doing is basically concentrating on the last 2 weeks of follicle maturation, the time of so-called gonadotropin sensitivity. That's what we have been doing. Yes, IVF has happened, but it is still taking place in those last 2 weeks. And the paradigm change, I think, that we have to start considering seriously is that if we really want to take the next big step, it is not very helpful to try to intervene at the very end of a 2, 3, 4 months period when basically the fate of the egg, of the follicle, of the oocyte is largely determined. It seems kind of naive to assume that we're there at that late stage of follicular maturation and oocyte maturation still can have significant impact. So if we want to take the next step, the paradigm change has to be that we start intervening clinically into earlier stages of follicle maturation. And androgen supplementation, as I will show you, is really the first clinically valid example that does exactly that. Because, as you heard from Aritra, the time period in follicle maturation that is particularly sensitive to androgens are the small growing follicles. That the early stages of follicle maturation are right after recruitment. So what has been happening with androgen supplementation is really a good first example for early intervention into follicle maturation, and you will later in this conference hear from Dr. Barad about a second such intervention with the use of human growth hormone, which we currently started to investigate in a clinical trial. And then we will talk about other related opportunities. So let's talk a little bit about follicle maturation. You all know this story here. You know that the biggest oocyte reserve, the biggest ovarian reserve, exists in utero. Even in utero, the female loses very rapidly, even more rapidly than after birth and after menarche, egg follicles in her ovaries. Indeed, after menarche, it's the slowest loss. So much more is lost from intrauterine life and premenarcheal than after menarche. And that loss obviously continues with constant recruitment of follicles. And this is a very important slide because what it basically suggests to you is that our long-standing practice of looking at women per single cycle is really outdated. Because when you look at the time that it takes from recruitment until a mature follicle is generated, on the average, there's 1, 2, 3 plus such cycles. And you have seen in the literature in recent years increasing evidence that our old practice of starting stimulation day 2 or day 3 or day 5 with Clomid is also outdated because you can basically start stimulation anytime in the cycle. And that should not surprise you when you look at this. Because at any of these points, there are follicles in the pipeline at all of these stages. And so it really, theoretically, should have been clear to us for decades that our old belief we have to start exactly on day 2 or day 3 or day 5 or whatever it is, kind of doesn't make physiological sense. Now, let's talk about this paradigm change. As I already mentioned, we have up till now concentrated on the last 2 weeks of this journey, and the new concept that I suggest to you we have to start thinking about if we want to continue improving our performance in infertility treatment is much earlier intervention. And as I also said, what has been happening over the last 12 years with the use of androgen supplementation in certain selected infertile women is probably the best example. And I will not go into the theoretical issues that Aritro has presented to you, but this is basically a summary slide why androgen supplementation is the first example of this paradigm change. Because what you see here is that right after recruitment from the primary, increasing through the secondary, not shown here, preantral and early antral stage, there is an increasing number of androgen receptors aside from FSH receptors visible on follicles. This, in other words, is the phase where androgen supplementation is essential in women who have low androgen levels. This is where your treatment causes its effects. But obviously, a follicle that is exposed to androgens at these early stages still needs weeks to months to reach the gonadotropin-sensitive phase, and that's why it is important to pre-treat. And there was before a question to Dr. Sen, how long to treat? And we empirically, in our early studies, defined 6 weeks of pre-treatment as minimum time, but we showed that after that, for up to 5 months, the effects still cumulatively accrue. So the minimum is 6 weeks, but we, as I will show you in a little while, we now base our pre-treatment period no longer on a set time period like 6 weeks, but on very specific androgen levels that we are trying to achieve with supplementation. And Aritro also made the point that we learned that the effects of androgens are synergistic with FSH effects, indeed, that androgen really increases the sensitivity of granulosa cells to FSH, and Aritro's lab has beautifully worked out the details as he presented to you. So I also mentioned to you that this started about, David, 12 years ago, roughly? 11 years ago. So roughly 11 years ago, when, let me jump through this, when a woman walked into my office at age 42, almost 43, and wanted to go through IVF. And at that point, 42, 43 was very old. Today it would no longer be that old at our center. And we started treating her with IVF cycles. And I will show you in a minute that this woman went through 10 consecutive back-to-back IVF cycles. But before I do that, I want to show you some of the work that made us understand what we are doing when we are supplementing women with androgens, and particularly with DHEA. And this is some of Aritro's work. And what you see here is mouse data from work done a few years ago, where you see the number of follicles on this axis, and the FSH stimulation, and the FSH plus DHEA supplementation. And you see the increase in follicle numbers in the ovary. Aritra has shown you that number. And then the androgen action was blocked with an antagonist, flutamide, and you see once again the reduction. So this work was done after we produced clinical work on DHEA, and we wanted to confirm in an animal model that DHEA indeed did what we thought we observed in clinical practice. And this is the model that Adritra also showed you, that the action goes through testosterone action, androgen receptor, improved follicular survival, improved AMH, and improved FSH sensitivity, giving us more and better eggs. This was also since confirmed in large animal studies, but there have been no prospective randomized studies of adequate power, and a lot of studies have been reported. They're all underpowered, and therefore they are unreliable. And this has been a major point of criticism of androgen by some people who believe that everything that we do in clinical practice has to be based on prospectively randomized studies. We do not believe that, because in medical practice you cannot do prospectively randomized studies on everything. We and others, as I said, have tried very hard to do prospectively randomized studies using androgen supplementation. We had to cancel 2 such trials because we just couldn't recruit enough patients who were willing to be randomized. That's why it is so important to have biological models that explain the activity. This is the graphic representation. Since Aritra showed you basically the same slide, I will jump this and go directly into the clinical data. And what you see here is a study that we reported in 2013, where we, for the first time, were able, largely based on the animal data that Aritra had generated, to investigate the hypothesis that if androgen worked in women with low ovarian reserve, then shouldn't there be a reason for it to work? And what would be the obvious reason? Low androgen levels. And what this study indeed demonstrated is that when you look in women with low ovarian reserve, whether it is due to old age or due to premature ovarian aging, you will uniformly find that their testosterone, both free and total testosterone, are relatively low. Now, they may still be normal range, because the normal range of testosterone is very wide, because it involves women of all ages, but when you compare it to controls, it is significantly lower. And that obviously makes sense from what Aritra told you, that low androgen levels interfere with normal follicular processes, with normal follicular growth, and exactly the phenomena that we observed in patients with low ovarian reserve, namely that they produce fewer eggs, poorer egg quality, were the observation that he showed you when the androgen receptor, in other words, androgen function in animal models, was knocked out. Now, we in this study also made the first connection between low androgen and poor adrenal function, but that is a topic for another lecture. But this is data that has since been confirmed and has also become a very important consideration in our practice. Now, this is this patient who came at almost age 43, and in her first IVF cycle had 1 egg and 1 embryo. Not surprising. At this point, we basically told her she has to go into egg donation. She begged on her knees for a chance of a second trial, And this is what happened to her in terms of egg and embryo numbers over the ensuing cycles. After her 6th cycle, she came smiling into my office. We obviously couldn't refuse her at this point when every cycle she got better. Somewhere around here, she turned 43. She came in smiling into my office and said, "Dr. Gleicher, I have to tell you a secret." And the secret was that she had started taking DHEA supplementation. She was a very smart lawyer and banker who had gone to the literature, had found a paper from the Baylor Group, which suggested that women who produced very few eggs could improve their egg numbers by taking DHEA. It was a very small case series. The hypothesis was that DHEA increased IGF and in the ovary, and that was the cause of the improvement. In the US, for those of you who are from abroad, DHEA is considered a food supplement, therefore it is available without prescription. And she said, "Yeah, I found some other concepts too, but for everything else I would have needed your prescription. This was the only thing I could get without telling you." And this was the beginning of our investigation 11 years ago of DHEA. And believe me, we had absolutely no idea at that point why we were observing this. But as we started studying it, we noticed and reported in quite a number of controlled studies, not prospectively randomized, but otherwise either case-controlled or otherwise controlled studies, that DHEA supplementation improved egg and embryo numbers, improved egg and embryo quality, improved spontaneous pregnancy chances, while the patients were on DHEA and were waiting to go into IVF cycles. We saw surprising numbers of spontaneous pregnancy, improved IVF pregnancy rates, improved time to conception, and obviously improved cumulative pregnancy chances. And those are some of the references where we published these data. About 5 or 6 years ago, an international survey showed amongst IVF centers that roughly, at that time already, a third of all IVF centers had started using DHEA supplementation. I'm sure the number has since greatly increased. Some of the observations that we made and reported in those years, I'm so sorry, that with DHEA use, AMH increases, and this is the total increase. Younger women obviously showed better increases than older women, but even older women improved their AMH values. What you see here is miscarriage rates. And the light blue numbers represent US SART data, miscarriage rates at different ages. The dark blue represent combined data between our center and the Toronto Center, whose leader is sitting in the audience here. One day he sent me an email with a huge data set attached to it, and this center was probably the first one that had picked up on our DHEA protocol. We combined data, and what you see here is that after age 35, DHEA supplementation highly significantly reduced miscarriage rates. The reduction was so remarkable that our conclusion was it had to affect ploidy, and so we started a study of PGS. In those days, day 3 biopsies, and you see there were indeed significant differences between patients who had androgen supplementation and those who did not. The androgen supplementation did significantly decrease aneuploidy rates. So I mentioned already that there are no adequately performed RCTs. And I also believe that there likely will never be any. So to hope for that one RCT before you do or do not decide to use it, I think, is naive. We discussed why prospective randomized clinical trials are so rare in reproductive medicine recently, and discussed DHEA or androgen supplementation as one I'm sorry, as one example. There are other data, there are other ways to obtain data, and I think what we demonstrated with androgen supplementation is a very good example. And those of you who read The Last Human Reproduction, even Hans Evers, who is a very, very big proponent of RCTs, suddenly came around to the concept of what he called plausible research, meaning that if there needs to be a plausible reason for a research project, and there is no better plausible motivation for something than understanding the underlying processes. And we are extremely grateful, therefore, to Ritro's lab, because without his research, we would still not have any understanding why things have worked. Just as another way of background, this is what happens to androgen levels once we get older. There is a dramatic drop in androgen levels, both in women and men, after 38, but particularly after age 40. And this is what happens to testosterone levels in women with low ovarian reserve, and therefore with low testosterone levels after supplementation. What you see here is base points here for total testosterone, here for free testosterone. The findings are a little bit more significant for total testosterone. Therefore, we use total testosterone primarily to assess testosterone levels, but we also test free testosterone. Look what happened. White circles are patients who conceived. Black circles are patients who did not conceive. Again, all patients with low ovarian reserve. You see that those that conceived actually started with lower testosterone levels, and look how much higher the testosterone levels were after at least 6 weeks of DHEA supplementation. The same thing, slightly lesser degree, with free testosterone. So the delta that you achieve is predictive of success in IVF. And again, I think that makes a lot of sense. Here, you see also some evidence for the synergistic effects of androgen supplementation because in this study by Dr. Barat, followed oocytes retrieved in patients who had at least 3 consecutive cycles with relative short intervals between cycles. And you can see that literally, like our first patient, so well demonstrated, literally from cycle to cycle, patient under DHEA supplementation improve their egg numbers. Okay? Now, what does all of this do to patients with low ovarian reserve? Here you see the results. Now, I want to point out those are 2015 data from our center. And you can see here is the code for the various age groups. You can see that our center serves a unique patient population with over 60% of patients being above age 41. And these patients usually have high FSH. Over 90% of our patients come to us after they have failed multiple IVF cycles, usually at multiple IVF centers. Still, these are our pregnancy rates at different age groups, compatible with pretty much any IVF center in the US, which has much younger patients and patients with much better ovarian reserve. We could not achieve these numbers if we were not supplementing our patients with androgens. This is the same presentation in numbers. So, human growth hormone, I will not be talking much about it, except making the point that there's obviously no consensus at the current time on its effects. We think that the reason is that all the studies that have been performed over the last 20 to 30 years have supplemented human growth hormone usually only during the cycle, during stimulation, and as I've mentioned before, the physiology of follicle maturation suggests that IGF-1, which is the active ingredient of human growth hormone, has the same timing as androgens. In other words, the greatest effects are on small growing follicles. So like we have to wait at least 6 weeks for those treated follicles to reach the gonadotropin sensitive phase, we think the same thing applies also to human growth hormone. And so therefore we have currently a clinical trial going where we do 8 weeks of human growth hormone before we start IVF cycles. Dr. Barat will be talking a little bit more on this subject. Thank you very much. These are the members of our center and some of our visiting scientists with whom we collaborate. Much of what we do is now collaborations with major research centers like Aritra's lab at the University of Rochester, Ali Privanlu's lab at Rockefeller University. The Salk Institute, we find that not only rewarding, but we find it as a basic, essential model for research in our field today. Thank you very much.